Sheriff, remove him. Mayor Tom Grayson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone in the council chamber already agreed with him. Everyone except Henry Whitaker. The 82-year-old veteran remained standing beside the window, overlooking Eagle Creek. Around him, 7 engineers sat behind stacks of reports, geological assessments, drone surveys, and 6 months of monitoring data. Every document on the table pointed to the same conclusion. The mountain above town was stable. Henry was the only person in the room arguing otherwise. "Mr. Whitaker," the mayor said, forcing patience into his voice, "you've made your point." Henry didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the clock hanging on the wall. It was 11:17 in the morning. Then he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. The sheriff stopped moving. One of the engineers leaned forward. The mayor frowned. "What is that?" Without saying a word, Henry walked to the table and spread the papers across the polished wood surface. The engineer closest to him picked up the first page. Names, addresses, emergency contacts, medical notes. Then another page, and another. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Henry met his eyes. "The people who need help leaving first." The room went quiet. Outside, Eagle Creek was preparing for the biggest weekend of the year. Vendors were setting up booths. Volunteers were hanging banners across Main Street. Delivery trucks rolled through town carrying supplies for the Summer Heritage Festival. By sunset, more than 5,000 visitors were expected to arrive. Inside the council chamber, an old veteran was asking them to evacuate the entire town. Today, the town engineer, Ethan Mercer, slowly pushed back his chair. He was 34 years old, highly respected, and responsible for overseeing every geological survey conducted on the mountain during the previous 18 months. He wasn't careless and he wasn't arrogant. The data simply didn't support what Henry was saying. "Based on what?" Ethan finally asked. Henry looked toward the mountain beyond the window. The answer sounded ridiculous even to him. A stream that had changed color, bee colonies abandoning their hives, a sound beneath the ground he hadn't heard in more than 50 years. None of those things appeared in the reports scattered across the table. None of them appeared in the computer models. None of them would survive scrutiny from a room full of engineers. "You have 6 hours, Henry said quietly. The mayor rubbed his forehead. "Henry, you don't know that." "No," Henry replied, "I don't." For a brief moment, the room relaxed. Then Henry placed his hand on the evacuation list. "But if I'm right, 6 hours is already less time than we need." Nobody had an answer for that. The sheriff looked at the mayor. The mayor looked at Ethan. Ethan looked down at the pages spread across the table. More than 200 names, every one of them carefully organized. Every one of them prepared long before this meeting had ever begun. The question hanging in the room wasn't whether Henry believed what he was saying. The question was why. What nobody there knew was that Henry had spent 12 years building that evacuation list. What nobody knew was that he had once watched 19 men disappear beneath a collapsing mountainside. And what nobody knew was that one of those 19 men had been his younger brother. If you want to know why an 82-year-old veteran was willing to stand alone against 7 geological surveys, stay with us. And if you believe experience still matters in a world increasingly driven by screens and data, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Because before this day was over, Eagle Creek would discover that some warnings never appear on a computer screen. And some mistakes take a lifetime to repay. 3 weeks earlier, Henry Whitaker was standing beside a row of beehives behind his house when he noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. 3 weeks earlier, Henry Whitaker was standing beside a row of beehives behind his house when he noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. At first, it seemed insignificant. The morning looked exactly like hundreds of other mornings he had experienced in Eagle Creek. A cool breeze drifted through the valley, sunlight spread across the foothills, and somewhere beyond the trees a narrow stream carried mountain water toward town. Nothing about the landscape suggested danger. Nothing about the air felt unusual. Yet as Henry stood in front of hive number 4, waiting for the familiar hum that greeted him every morning, he found only silence. He moved closer and studied the entrance. A handful of bees still crawled across the weathered wood, but the constant activity he expected to see was gone. No workers returned carrying pollen. No cloud of insects hovered above the hive. No steady vibration filled the air. Curious, he checked the next hive and then another. By the time he finished inspecting all 12 boxes, nearly half of his colonies had disappeared. Most people would have blamed disease. Others might have blamed weather. Henry blamed neither. The bees had not died. They had left. After 82 years of observing the natural world, he had learned that animals often notice changes long before human beings did. He told nobody. Instead, he followed the same routine he had followed for years. He made coffee, walked the fence line, checked the gate near the stream, and finally settled onto the porch with a notebook resting on his knee. The notebook looked ordinary enough, but Henry had been filling notebooks like it for more than half a century. Weather observations, road conditions, water levels, unusual animal behavior, seasonal changes, small details that most people forgot almost immediately. Henry rarely forgot anything. That morning he wrote a single sentence: Hive 4 abandoned. Then he closed the notebook and looked toward the mountain. The ridge dominated the horizon above Eagle Creek. Most residents barely noticed it anymore. It appeared in wedding photographs, tourist brochures, and postcards sold in gift shops downtown. It framed football games, church picnics, and holiday parades. For most people, it was simply part of the scenery. For Henry, it had always been something more. 2 days later, he noticed the second sign. The stream crossing his property carried water down from the mountain before winding through the valley. Henry knew every bend of it. He knew where the current accelerated after heavy rain and where ice formed first during winter. On that particular morning, something felt different. The change was subtle enough that another person might have missed it entirely. The water carried a faint gray tint he had never seen before. He filled a glass jar and carried it into his workshop. Along one wall stood shelves lined with similar jars collected over the years. Henry placed the new sample beside several older ones and immediately saw the difference. The latest jar appeared darker, not dramatically darker, just enough to catch the eye of someone who paid attention. Again, he told nobody. Instead, he opened the notebook and added another entry: unusual discoloration in stream. Then he returned to work. As the days passed, Eagle Creek became increasingly busy. The Summer Heritage Festival was approaching, and preparations consumed nearly every corner of town. Volunteers assembled stages in the square. Local businesses decorated storefronts. Hotels filled with reservations. Delivery trucks arrived carrying supplies for weekend events. Everywhere Henry looked, people were preparing for celebration. He found himself preparing for something else. The third sign arrived 11 days before the council meeting. It came shortly after midnight. Henry woke suddenly and sat upright in bed. At first he couldn't explain what had disturbed him. The room was dark. The house was silent. Then he heard it. A crack. Deep. Distant. Brief. The sound lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Most people would have mistaken it for thunder. There were no storms that night. Henry stepped onto the porch and listened. The valley stretched beneath a sky crowded with stars. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared unusual. Then the sound returned, faint, far away, a low fracture rolling through the darkness, not loud enough to wake the town, loud enough to wake him. He remained outside for nearly 20 minutes before returning indoors. The sound never came again, but sleep didn't return either. The following morning he drove into town and stopped by the engineering office. Ethan Mercer happened to be there reviewing survey data. The younger man greeted him with an easy smile and invited him inside. "What brings you here?" Ethan asked. Henry hesitated. Even then, he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. "You had any unusual readings lately?" Ethan looked surprised. "From the mountain?" Henry nodded. The engineer spent several moments reviewing reports before eventually shaking his head. "No movement, no groundwater pressure issues, no seismic concerns. Everything looks normal." Henry thanked him and left. Ethan never gave the conversation another thought. Henry did, because normal wasn't the word he would have used. 5 days before the council meeting, another bee colony disappeared. 3 days later, 2 more followed. The stream became slightly darker. The strange sounds returned during the night. One evening, after spending nearly an hour staring at the ridgeline, Henry walked into the back of his workshop and pulled an old metal box from a shelf. Dust coated the lid. The hinges creaked when he opened it. Inside were photographs, field notes, maps, and military records nobody else had seen in years. Henry sat down and picked up a photograph worn soft at the corners. 19 young men stood together in front of a mountainside. They were smiling, relaxed, certain tomorrow would arrive exactly as expected. One of them was his younger brother. For a long time, Henry stared at the image without moving. The mountain outside his window wasn't the same mountain. The year wasn't the same year. The circumstances weren't the same. But the feeling was. That was the part he couldn't ignore. 3 days later, he began updating the evacuation list. 2 days later, he called the nursing home. 1 day later, he reviewed emergency access routes throughout the valley. Then, at 8:42 on the morning of the council meeting, Henry Whitaker made a decision he had hoped he would never have to make. If nobody else was willing to sound the alarm, he would do it himself. Even if nobody believed him, even if he turned out to be wrong. Because 52 years earlier he had made the opposite choice. And 19 men had paid the price. What Henry still hadn't told anyone was why that memory haunted him so deeply. The answer wasn't hidden in the mountain standing above Eagle Creek. It was hidden in a decision he had made on the worst day of his life. By the time Henry Whitaker finished speaking, the atmosphere inside the council chamber had changed. Nobody had agreed with him, and nobody had called for an evacuation. Yet the confidence that had filled the room earlier that morning was no longer quite as solid as before. The engineers had arrived carrying months of monitoring data, geological assessments, drone surveys, and stability reports that all pointed toward the same conclusion. The mountain above Eagle Creek was stable. Henry's warning had seemed less like a serious concern and more like an interruption. Now things felt different. Not because he had proven anything, he hadn't, but because he had introduced doubt, and doubt has a way of spreading through a room much faster than certainty. Ethan Mercer felt it first. The 34-year-old engineer stood beside the conference monitor, reviewing the data for a second time. He wasn't searching for proof that Henry was right. In fact, he still believed the old man was probably wrong. What bothered him was something else entirely. Throughout his career, Ethan had learned that major failures rarely occurred because people lacked information. More often, they happened because people stopped asking questions too soon. That realization was enough to make him order a second review of the sensor records. For several minutes, the technician examined data that had already been processed and categorized by the monitoring system. Most of it meant nothing. Small fluctuations appeared constantly due to weather, wildlife, equipment noise, and countless other harmless variables. Outside the council chamber, Eagle Creek continued preparing for the Summer Heritage Festival. Vendors opened booths, delivery trucks, unloaded supplies, and families wandered through downtown streets, beneath banners celebrating the weekend festivities. Through the windows, the town looked peaceful enough to belong on a postcard. Inside, however, the mood had shifted. The technician enlarged one section of data after another until he suddenly stopped. Ethan noticed immediately. A second anomaly had appeared. It was small, recorded by a different sensor, several hours after the first irregularity, and like the previous reading, it had been automatically classified as interference. Under normal circumstances, nobody would have looked at it twice. Yet seeing two unexplained anomalies where there should have been none was enough to draw everyone's attention. Mayor Grayson stepped closer to the monitor and asked what it meant. Ethan studied the graph before answering. The truth was uncomfortable. He didn't know. Nobody in the room liked that answer. Technology was supposed to reduce uncertainty, but uncertainty was exactly what had begun creeping back into the conversation. Throughout the discussion, Henry remained near the window watching the mountain. He had barely spoken for nearly half an hour. While everyone else focused on graphs and reports, he found himself counting time. 3 weeks. That was how long the signs had been building. 3 weeks since the bees began abandoning their hives. 3 weeks since the stream changed color. 3 weeks since he started waking in the middle of the night, listening for sounds nobody else seemed able to hear. The mountain had been speaking for weeks. The question was whether anyone else was finally beginning to listen. At 11:38 a.m., Ethan made another decision. He wanted visual confirmation. When the mayor suggested another drone flight, Ethan shook his head and requested a helicopter instead. The answer surprised several people. A helicopter survey would cost more and take longer to arrange. But Ethan wasn't thinking about costs anymore. He wanted certainty, and certainty was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Within 30 minutes, the aircraft was airborne and heading toward the western face of the mountain, while the council chamber listened through the radio. The first pass revealed nothing unusual. The second pass produced the same result. By the third pass, several council members were beginning to relax. Perhaps Henry's fears really were nothing more than old memories resurfacing. Perhaps the monitoring anomalies were exactly what the system claimed they were. Then the pilot requested that the coordinates be repeated. The room became still. Ethan reached for the microphone and asked what he was seeing. A long pause followed before the pilot finally answered. He wasn't sure. No engineer enjoys hearing those words. The helicopter adjusted course and circled back. This time the pilot reported what appeared to be a fracture line. Questions came immediately. How large was it? How deep? How old? The answers were frustratingly incomplete. The pilot estimated the fracture stretched roughly 20 yards and appeared recent. That single word changed everything. Not because it confirmed Henry's warning, but because it confirmed the mountain had changed. Recent meant the feature had not existed long ago. Recent meant something was happening. Recent meant the engineers no longer had a complete explanation for what they were seeing. The photographs arrived shortly afterward, and everyone gathered around the monitor. The fracture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make headlines or frighten an average resident. To most people, it looked like a thin scar running across a distant slope. Yet the longer the engineers studied the images, the more uncomfortable the room became. According to the most recent surveys, that fracture should not have been there. The discussion that followed lasted nearly 40 minutes. Possible explanations were proposed and challenged one after another. Seasonal movement, surface settling, freeze-thaw expansion, natural erosion. Every theory sounded reasonable, yet none of them felt complete. For the first time that day, Ethan stopped trying to explain Henry away and started trying to understand him. He turned toward the old veteran and asked when he had first become concerned. Henry answered without hesitation. 3 weeks ago, The engineer asked about the bees. Henry nodded. He asked about the stream. Another nod. Then Ethan asked what else he had noticed. For the first time all afternoon, something shifted in Henry's expression. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was memory. He looked back toward the ridgeline beyond the window, but everyone in the room could tell he wasn't really looking at the mountain anymore. He was looking at something much older. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "The sound," he said. The same sound he had heard 52 years ago. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody suggested he was imagining things. The room had moved beyond that point. Over the course of a few hours, Henry Whitaker had transformed from an old man making uncomfortable claims into a man carrying knowledge nobody else possessed. Whether that knowledge was correct remained uncertain, but it was no longer easy to dismiss. Outside, festival music echoed through the streets of Eagle Creek, while children ran between vendor tents and families filled the sidewalks. The town continued moving toward celebration. Inside the council chamber, however, everyone was staring at a fracture line that hadn't existed a week earlier, and listening to an old veteran who seemed to recognize something nobody else could see. The question was no longer whether Henry believed the mountain was dangerous. The question was whether the mountain was already running out of time. At 12:47 p.m., Mayor Tom Grayson called a recess. Nobody objected. The meeting had reached a point where more discussion was producing more questions than answers. Engineers continued reviewing photographs of the fracture line, while technicians dug through monitoring records for anything they might have missed. The sheriff stepped into the hallway to take a phone call, and Ethan Mercer finally walked outside for a few minutes of fresh air. Only Henry Whitaker remained where he was, standing near the window and staring at the mountain. From a distance, the ridgeline looked exactly the way it always had. Pine forests covered its slopes. Sunlight washed across the higher elevations. A few clouds drifted lazily overhead. Looking at it now, nobody would have guessed that the entire town council had spent the morning arguing about whether it posed a threat. The mountain appeared calm, patient, and completely indifferent to the concern it was causing below. Henry knew better than most people how deceptive that appearance could be. Dangerous things rarely looked dangerous until it was too late. A soft knock pulled him away from his thoughts. Sheriff Collins stood beside him holding a bottle of water. The two men had known each other for nearly 20 years and had long since grown comfortable with silence. Henry accepted the bottle with a nod. "You haven't eaten all day," the sheriff said. "I'm not hungry." The sheriff studied him for a moment before asking the question everyone else seemed reluctant to ask. "What happened 52 years ago?" Henry looked down at the bottle in his hands. For a brief moment it seemed as though he might answer. Instead, he slowly shook his head. "Not today." The sheriff nodded. Some memories carried their own weight. There was no need to force them open. Outside the council building, however, the situation was beginning to change. Eagle Creek was a small town, and small towns had always possessed their own communication networks. News traveled through coffee shops, hardware stores, church parking lots, and grocery store checkout lines faster than any official announcement ever could. A council meeting running hours behind schedule attracted attention. Emergency vehicles parked outside attracted even more. By early afternoon, rumors had already spread through much of town. Some people believed there had been a wildfire reported beyond the ridge. Others claimed a chemical leak had contaminated the stream. A few whispered that the mountain itself was becoming unstable. That last rumor spread the fastest. By 1:18 p.m., Ethan Mercer received a call from one of his field technicians stationed near the Western Access Road. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but when it ended, Ethan immediately returned to the council chamber. The expression on his face was enough to silence the room before he even spoke. "What happened?" the mayor asked. The fracture widened. The statement landed heavily. Nobody overreacted. Nobody panicked. Yet everyone in the room understood the significance. Ethan pulled up the latest photographs and displayed them beside the images taken earlier that day. At first glance, the difference seemed almost invisible, but after several seconds, it became clear. The fracture line had expanded, not dramatically, not by feet or even yards, but it had grown, and mountains were not supposed to change that quickly. "What does it mean?" the mayor asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. "It means the slope is active." The room fell quiet again. Active did not mean collapse. It did not mean disaster. It did not automatically justify an evacuation. What it meant was far more uncomfortable. Something was happening, and nobody could explain exactly what that something was. The afternoon wore on. Another call arrived from the County Emergency Management Office. State geologists reviewed the photographs and offered a cautious assessment. There was not enough evidence to recommend a mandatory evacuation, but there was enough evidence to justify additional investigation. The conclusion satisfied no one. It left the town trapped between action and inaction, between confidence and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the festival crowds continued growing. More vehicles entered Eagle Creek every hour. Parking lots filled. Hotels checked in guests. Families crowded the sidewalks carrying shopping bags and festival programs. Every passing minute increased the number of people who might eventually need to leave if Henry's fears proved correct. The mayor knew it. The sheriff knew it. Ethan knew it. Nobody needed to say it aloud. Shortly after 2 p.m., Ethan walked over to where Henry stood near the window. The younger engineer looked exhausted, as if the day had aged him far more than the passing hours should have allowed. "You really started worrying 3 weeks ago?" he asked. Henry nodded. "Because of the bees." "That was part of it. And the stream." Henry nodded again. Ethan hesitated before asking the next question. "What else?" For the first time all day, Henry looked away from the mountain and toward the engineer. "The sound." Ethan frowned. "What sound?" The old veteran remained silent for several seconds. His eyes drifted back toward the ridgeline beyond the glass. Everyone nearby sensed that he was no longer looking at the mountain standing above Eagle Creek. He was looking at another mountain entirely. Finally, he answered, "The same sound I heard 52 years ago." Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody suggested he was imagining things. The room had moved beyond that point. Over the course of a few hours, Henry Whitaker had transformed from an old man making uncomfortable claims into a man carrying knowledge nobody else possessed. Whether that knowledge was correct remained uncertain, but it was no longer easy to dismiss. The next interruption came from a young technician carrying a tablet. He approached the mayor and handed over the device without saying a word. As the mayor studied the image on the screen, the color slowly drained from his face. "What is it?" Ethan asked. The mayor turned the tablet around. The fracture line was no longer the only visible change on the mountain. Several hundred yards below it, a section of the slope had begun pushing outward. The movement was subtle enough that most residents would never have noticed it, but nobody in the room needed an engineering degree to understand what they were seeing. The mountain was moving. For the first time that day, the discussion shifted. The question was no longer whether action might become necessary. The question was whether they still had enough time to act before the mountain made the decision for them. At 2:26 p.m., Mayor Tom Grayson made the call he had spent the entire day trying to avoid. Officially, Eagle Creek still had not declared an emergency. No evacuation order had been issued, no warning sirens had sounded, and no public announcement had been made. To anyone walking through town, life appeared completely normal. Yet inside the council chamber, the conversation had crossed an invisible line. The mayor instructed emergency management personnel to begin preparing contingency plans. Additional buses were requested from neighboring counties. School facilities outside the valley were contacted about serving as temporary shelters. The nursing home was placed on standby. On paper, these actions were merely precautions. In reality, they represented the first steps of a town quietly preparing for the possibility that Henry Whitaker might be right. The greatest problem was not uncertainty, it was time. Henry had understood that from the beginning. Most emergency plans looked efficient when spread across a conference table. Routes were clearly marked. Contact numbers were organized. Procedures were documented. Everything appeared manageable until real people became involved. Elderly residents needed transportation. Patients depended on oxygen equipment. Families became separated. Roads became congested. Some people refused to leave their homes. Others delayed because they believed there was still plenty of time. Henry had spent 12 years thinking about those problems, which was why Ethan Mercer found himself increasingly fascinated by the evacuation list spread across the table. The more closely he examined it, the more he realized it wasn't simply a list. It was a living document. Medical conditions had been updated. Emergency contacts had been verified. Handwritten notes described mobility limitations, transportation needs, and residents who lived alone. Entire sections identified people who would need immediate assistance if the town ever had to move quickly. Nothing about the document suggested panic. Everything about it suggested patience. "How long have you been working on this?" Ethan finally asked. 12 years. The engineer looked up. 12 years preparing for a landslide? Henry shook his head. 12 years preparing for people. The answer lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. Throughout the afternoon, engineers continued studying photographs, while emergency coordinators made phone calls and reviewed transportation resources. The fracture line remained visible. The bulge farther down the slope remained visible. Neither development proved a collapse was imminent, but neither could be comfortably explained anymore. Every new image seemed to remove another layer of confidence. The situation still lacked certainty, yet it no longer lacked concern. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Ethan stepped outside and walked toward the edge of the festival grounds. The contrast unsettled him. Music drifted through the afternoon air. Children carried balloons between vendor booths. Couples browsed craft displays. Visitors stood in line for food, while local musicians performed beneath brightly colored banners. Everywhere he looked, people were laughing. People were spending money. People were making plans for the evening. Nobody seemed aware that inside the council chamber, officials were quietly discussing evacuation routes. Ethan found himself staring toward the mountain rising beyond town. It looked exactly the way it always had. Green slopes, dense forests, sunlight washing across the ridgeline. Nothing about its appearance suggested danger, yet he could not stop thinking about Henry's expression whenever the conversation turned to the strange sounds he had heard. The old veteran had not sounded uncertain. He had sounded haunted. Ethan had spent enough years around people to recognize the difference. When he returned to the council chamber, he found Henry standing in the same place near the window. The old man had spent most of the day watching the mountain while everyone else watched screens. Ethan walked over and followed his gaze towards the ridge. "You keep looking out there," he said. Henry nodded. "What are you waiting for?" The old veteran remained silent for several moments before answering. "I'm listening." Ethan frowned. "For what?" Henry continued staring at the mountain. "For it to change its mind." The answer made little sense, yet somehow it felt important. Before Ethan could ask another question, the door opened and a woman carrying a leather folder entered the room. She moved with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to difficult decisions. Her name was Martha Reynolds, and for nearly 3 decades she had managed the nursing home on the eastern side of town. Several people recognized her immediately. Without introducing herself, she accepted a copy of Henry's evacuation list and began reading. What happened next surprised everyone. "You updated the Wilson file?" she asked. Henry nodded. "They moved last year." "What about Mr. Hanley?" "New oxygen equipment, it's noted." Martha continued reading. "The Dawson twins, living with their daughter now." The exchange continued for several minutes. Name after name, address after address, medical note after medical note. Neither of them needed to explain what they were discussing because both clearly knew the list almost by memory. Ethan eventually leaned toward the mayor and quietly asked how long they had been doing this. Before the mayor could answer, Martha looked up from the paperwork. 12 years, she said. Every 6 months, sometimes more often. The room fell silent. Martha closed the folder and rested her hand on top of it before looking around the table. "You all think Henry is worried about the mountain," she said. "You're wrong." Nobody interrupted. "The mountain is only the reason. The people are what he's worried about." The statement landed harder than anyone expected. For the first time all afternoon, Ethan understood that Henry's evacuation list was not a prediction. It was an act of responsibility. The old man wasn't trying to prove himself right. He was trying to make sure nobody would be forgotten if he happened to be right. The realization was still hanging over the room when another technician entered carrying a tablet. He wasn't running, but the urgency on his face immediately drew everyone's attention. Ethan took the device from him and opened the latest set of photographs. Within seconds, several engineers had gathered around the screen. Nobody needed an explanation. The evidence was visible immediately. The bulge beneath the fracture line had expanded again. The change wasn't dramatic enough to alarm the average resident, but everyone in that room had spent the day studying the mountain. They could see what the photographs were telling them. The movement was accelerating. No one spoke for several moments. Earlier that morning, the fracture line had been a curiosity. A few hours later, it had become a concern. Now it was becoming something else entirely. Ethan slowly looked up from the screen and toward the mountain, visible through the council chamber window. For the first time since the meeting began, he stopped asking whether Henry Whitaker might be wrong. Instead, he found himself wondering how much time they had left before the rest of the town realized he might be right. The latest photographs remained displayed on the monitor long after anyone stopped discussing them. The bulge beneath the fracture line had expanded again, and although the movement remained small enough to escape the attention of most residents, everyone inside the council chamber understood that something important was changing. Engineers continued examining measurements and comparing images, while emergency coordinators reviewed transportation plans and shelter capacities. Outside, the Summer Heritage Festival carried on without interruption. Music drifted through the open windows. Children ran between vendor booths. Families filled the sidewalks. The contrast between the two worlds felt increasingly surreal. One side of town was preparing for celebration. The other was quietly preparing for the possibility of disaster. Ethan Mercer found himself paying less attention to the mountain and more attention to Henry Whitaker. The old veteran sat near the far end of the room with a weathered notebook resting on his lap. Throughout the day, Ethan had watched him open it, write a few words, close it, and return his attention to the ridgeline beyond the window. There was something unsettling about the consistency of the ritual. Henry never seemed surprised by new developments. He never appeared eager to prove himself right. If anything, he looked like a man hoping to be wrong. The realization bothered Ethan more than the engineering reports. People seeking attention usually wanted validation. Henry seemed to want the exact opposite. He looked like a man carrying a burden he would gladly hand back if given the chance. As the afternoon wore on, the room gradually grew quieter. The debates that had dominated the morning had largely disappeared. Nobody was arguing over whether Henry's concerns deserved attention anymore. The discussion had shifted toward preparation, probabilities, and contingency plans. During a brief pause in the activity, Ethan crossed the room and sat beside the old veteran. For a while, neither man spoke. The silence felt natural rather than awkward. Eventually, Ethan glanced toward the notebook and asked whether Henry had always kept records. A faint smile appeared on the old man's face. He explained that he had spent most of his life writing things down because memory was unreliable. People believed they remembered events clearly, but over time, memories changed shape, details disappeared, emotions rewrote facts. The notebook helped preserve what actually happened. Ethan nodded, then asked how long Henry had been keeping them. The answer surprised him. More than 50 years. Henry had filled dozens of notebooks over the decades. Weather observations, road conditions, unusual sounds, animal behavior, small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but sometimes became important later. As he spoke, his hand rested unconsciously on the notebook cover, almost as though he were protecting something. The conversation drifted naturally toward the photograph Ethan had seen earlier in Henry's workshop. He remembered the image clearly. 19 young men standing together in front of heavy equipment near a mountainside. One face in particular had stayed with him. The resemblance to Henry had been impossible to miss. Ethan mentioned it carefully, uncertain whether he was crossing a line. For several seconds, Henry didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the mountain beyond the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. The young man in the photograph had been his brother. The statement carried no drama and no visible emotion, which somehow made it feel heavier. Ethan waited for him to continue, but Henry said nothing else. The engineer considered asking another question and decided against it. Some silences revealed more than answers ever could. Around them, the council chamber continued operating, but the sounds seemed distant now. Phones rang, papers shuffled, conversations rose and fell. None of it felt particularly important compared to the memory that had just entered the room. A little later, as sunlight began sinking toward the western horizon, Henry opened the notebook again. This time he removed a folded photograph from between its pages. The image was old enough that the colors had faded almost completely. He studied it for a long moment before handing it to Ethan. It was the same photograph from the workshop, but seeing it here felt different. Ethan examined each face carefully. Young men, confident men, men who looked as though they expected life to unfold exactly as planned. Nobody in the picture appeared worried. Nobody appeared afraid. They looked like people standing at the beginning of a future. Ethan eventually looked up and found Henry watching the photograph rather than the mountain. It was the first time all day he had seen the old veteran do that. There was no bitterness in his expression, no anger. Only sadness so old it had become part of him. After a while, Henry reached over and tapped one corner of the photograph. "We thought we had plenty of time," he said. The sentence lingered between them. Ethan looked back at the image. What happened? Henry's gaze returned to the mountain. For several seconds, he seemed to be considering whether to answer. Then he slowly shook his head. Not today. It wasn't a refusal. It sounded more like a promise that the story existed, that it mattered, and that eventually it would need to be told. Before Ethan could say anything else, another engineer called his name from across the room. New survey data had arrived. Fresh measurements were appearing on the monitors. The mountain demanded attention once again. Ethan handed the photograph back and stood. As he walked away, he glanced over his shoulder and saw Henry carefully return the image to the notebook. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way someone handles an object that cannot be replaced. For the first time since the meeting began, Ethan understood that the mountain above Eagle Creek was only half the story. The other half had started more than 50 years earlier with 19 young men, a forgotten mountainside, and a day that Henry Whitaker had never truly left behind. By the time the sun disappeared behind the western ridge, the atmosphere inside the council chamber had changed again. Earlier in the day, uncertainty had been the dominant emotion. Now uncertainty was being replaced by something more dangerous: time pressure. The latest survey data showed continued movement along the slope. The changes remained small, but they were no longer isolated. Engineers had begun noticing patterns. Tiny shifts that meant little on their own started forming a picture that nobody found reassuring. Emergency coordinators continued preparing transportation resources while the mayor moved between conversations, trying to balance caution with responsibility. Every decision carried consequences. Declaring an evacuation too early could trigger panic and destroy the festival economy. Declaring it too late could cost lives. As the room wrestled with that reality, Ethan Mercer found his attention repeatedly drifting back toward Henry Whitaker. The photograph from earlier remained lodged in his mind. 19 young men standing together beneath a mountain, a younger brother, a promise that the story would eventually be told. The opportunity arrived later that evening. Most of the officials had left temporarily to coordinate with various departments throughout town. The council chamber, once crowded and noisy, had grown noticeably quieter. Outside, festival lights illuminated the streets, while music echoed faintly through the valley. Henry remained near the window, as he always seemed to do, watching the dark outline of the mountain against the evening sky. Ethan approached with 2 cups of coffee and offered one to him. The old veteran accepted it with a nod. For several moments neither man spoke. Then Ethan asked a simple question. Had he always known something was wrong that day, 52 years ago? Henry stared into the coffee cup before answering. The response came slowly, as though he were carefully selecting each word from a place he rarely visited. "No," he said. "That was the worst part. If he had known, he could have lived with the mistake. The truth was more complicated. He suspected. He worried. He noticed things that didn't fit. Yet suspicion was not certainty, and back then he had convinced himself that uncertainty was a reason to continue, rather than a reason to stop. The memory seemed to pull him somewhere far beyond the council chamber. The road project had been considered one of the most important infrastructure efforts in the region. Hundreds of people depended on it. Local politicians supported it, company executives supported it, engineers supported it. Delays were expensive. Every additional day cost money, and every decision faced pressure from schedules that never seemed flexible enough. Henry remembered feeling proud of his role. At 29, he had been responsible for supervising portions of the operation, and the responsibility felt like validation for years of hard work. Looking back, he understood how dangerous pride could become when combined with urgency. The warning signs had appeared gradually. Water emerged from places where no water should have existed. Small rockfalls became more frequent. Equipment operators occasionally reported unusual vibrations beneath the ground. None of the observations sounded dramatic when considered individually. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Henry saw that pattern. So did several older workers. The difference was that the older men trusted their instincts more than reports. Henry trusted reports more than instincts. One worker in particular had remained vivid in his memory. Bill Cartwright was nearly 60 years old at the time and had spent most of his life working around mountains. He possessed the kind of experience that rarely appeared on resumes, but often determined who survived difficult situations. 2 days before the collapse, Bill approached Henry and recommended temporarily shutting down operations. He couldn't provide engineering evidence. He couldn't point to a specific report. He simply believed something felt wrong. At the time, Henry viewed that reasoning as insufficient. The surveys showed stability. The measurements showed stability. The project remained ahead of schedule. Stopping operations would require explanations to supervisors who expected results. So Henry thanked Bill for his concern and continued working. The decision seemed reasonable. It even seemed responsible. That fact haunted him more than if the choice had been reckless. Most tragedies did not begin with obvious mistakes. They began with decisions that felt entirely justified at the time. Around the council chamber, the remaining officials continued their work while Henry spoke. Some listened openly. Others pretended to focus on paperwork while quietly following every word. Nobody interrupted. The old veteran explained that the weather improved dramatically on the morning of the collapse. After days of rain, the sky cleared. Sunlight returned. Workers arrived in better spirits than they had shown all week. Equipment moved back into position. Conversations became lighter. The mountain looked healthy, stable, predictable. Human beings often mistake the absence of visible danger for actual safety, and that morning nearly everyone made that mistake. Henry remembered watching his younger brother drive up the access road shortly after sunrise. He remembered exchanging a wave. He remembered thinking they would see each other at lunch. That memory remained painfully clear while many others had faded with time. Some moments seemed to carve themselves permanently into a person's mind. That wave was one of them. The first truly alarming report arrived later that morning. A bulldozer operator radioed in fresh cracking along a cut section near the northern face. The information reached Henry quickly. Looking back, he often imagined the countless alternative paths that could have begun at that moment. He could have suspended work. He could have ordered inspections. He could have evacuated the area until experts completed another review. Instead, he chose what appeared to be the practical solution. The operator was instructed to avoid the immediate section, while crews continued working elsewhere. The report would be reviewed. The issue would be investigated. The schedule would continue. For decades afterward, Henry replayed those decisions in his mind, not because he believed he had intended harm, but because he understood that intentions mattered very little once consequences arrived. A mountain does not care whether a mistake was reasonable. It does not care whether a person acted in good faith. Physics remains indifferent to human explanations. As darkness settled fully over Eagle Creek, the council chamber lights reflected against the windows, turning the mountain outside into little more than a shadow. Henry fell silent for a moment and looked toward that darkness. When he finally continued, his voice had grown quieter. He explained that the sound arrived before anyone saw the movement. It began as a deep, tearing roar, unlike anything he had heard before or since. Not thunder, not machinery, not an explosion. Something older, something that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. Workers stopped what they were doing and turned toward the slope. Birds erupted from the trees. Then the mountainside began to move. Henry did not describe the collapse in detail. He didn't need to. The expression on his face communicated more than the words ever could. Everyone listening understood enough. An entire section of the mountain had given way. Vehicles vanished. Equipment disappeared. Men who had been standing together seconds earlier were suddenly gone. When the dust settled, 19 workers never returned home. The room remained silent long after Henry finished speaking. Outside, the festival continued. Music drifted faintly through the night air while visitors moved between illuminated booths, unaware that a story from half a century earlier had just changed the way several leaders viewed the mountain above their town. Ethan stared at the table without speaking. For the first time, he understood why Henry had spent 12 years preparing evacuation lists. He understood why the old man tracked bees, streams, and strange sounds. Most of all, he understood that Henry's fear had never been about being right. It had always been about preventing history from repeating itself. Before anyone could speak, a technician hurried into the room, carrying updated survey results. The engineer reviewing the files froze almost immediately. Every conversation stopped. The latest measurements confirmed that movement along the slope was accelerating faster than any of the previous projections had predicted. For the first time since the emergency planning began, nobody in the room was discussing what might happen. They were discussing what was already happening. The updated measurements changed everything. Until that moment, the council chamber had been operating in the uncomfortable space between possibility and certainty. Engineers discussed scenarios. Emergency managers reviewed contingencies. Elected officials weighed consequences. Everyone understood that something might happen. The newest data removed the word might from the conversation. Movement along the slope was accelerating, not dramatically enough to justify panic, but rapidly enough that every expert in the room reached the same conclusion. The mountain was no longer simply showing warning signs. It was actively changing. Ethan Mercer stood over the monitor, studying the numbers for several minutes, hoping he had missed something. He checked the calculations twice, then a third time. The results remained the same. Across the room, Mayor Grayson saw the expression on the engineer's face and understood before a word was spoken. The discussion that followed lasted less than 10 minutes because there was very little left to debate. No one could predict precisely when the slope might fail. No one could guarantee that it would fail at all. Yet every hour they delayed increased the number of people who could become trapped if Henry's fears proved correct. Eventually, the mayor leaned back in his chair, looked around the room, and asked the question everyone had been avoiding since morning. If we decide to move people, how long do we need? The answer arrived from 3 different departments almost simultaneously, more than they had. The realization settled heavily over the room. Evacuations looked simple in movies. A warning was issued, people left, and the danger passed. Reality was slower. The nursing home alone required multiple vehicles, medical equipment, and trained personnel. Several assisted living residents depended on oxygen systems. Families staying in hotels needed information. Roads would become congested. Some residents would refuse to leave. Others would waste precious time trying to decide whether the warning was real. Henry had spent 12 years preparing for those realities because he knew how quickly time disappeared once a crisis began. As the room absorbed the implications, Ethan found himself looking toward the old veteran. Earlier that day, he had viewed Henry as an anxious observer. Now he was beginning to understand that the old man was the only person in the building who had lived through something similar. Experience did not make Henry infallible, but it gave weight to his warnings in a way no computer model could. Outside, Eagle Creek remained blissfully unaware of the debate unfolding inside the council building. Festival lights illuminated Main Street, restaurants remained busy, visitors filled hotel lobbies, live music echoed across the town square. Looking through the windows, it was difficult to believe that officials were discussing evacuation plans only a few hundred yards away. That contrast became even harder to ignore when a local television crew arrived requesting an interview about the festival. The mayor declined and instructed staff to keep all discussions private until a decision had been reached. The last thing he wanted was a rumor-driven panic, yet rumors were already spreading. Reports of emergency vehicles moving through town had been noticed. Residents had seen unfamiliar county personnel arriving throughout the afternoon. Questions were multiplying. The town could feel that something was wrong, even if nobody could yet explain what it was. Shortly after 9 o'clock, another call arrived from the survey team positioned near the western access road. This time the conversation lasted less than a minute. When Ethan ended the call, he remained standing with the phone in his hand for several seconds before speaking. The field team had confirmed fresh cracking near an area that had shown no visible movement earlier that afternoon. The development did not prove an imminent collapse, but it reinforced the same pattern that every new report seemed to support. The instability was spreading. Engineers immediately began comparing maps, while emergency coordinators recalculated evacuation priorities. As the room returned to work, Henry quietly walked toward the large map spread across the central table. He studied it for a moment and then placed a finger on a section of road running along the eastern side of town. "If you wait until morning," he said, "this route becomes your problem." Several people looked up. Henry traced the road with his finger. "The festival traffic will still be here. Hotel guests will still be here. You'll have twice as many vehicles trying to leave through the same corridor." Nobody challenged him. The observation was obvious once he said it. The uncomfortable truth was that every hour made evacuation more difficult. Waiting provided more information, but it also reduced flexibility. The balance between those two realities had become increasingly difficult to manage. For the next hour, the council chamber operated with growing urgency. Transportation plans were finalized. Contact lists were updated. Shelter coordinators confirmed available capacity. The nursing home administrator reviewed relocation procedures for the second time that evening. What had begun as preparation was gradually becoming execution. Even then, nobody had officially ordered an evacuation. The mayor continued searching for a threshold, a moment when the evidence would become strong enough to justify a decision affecting thousands of people. Deep down, however, he was beginning to understand something Henry had realized weeks earlier. Nature rarely provided perfect certainty before demanding action. The decision finally arrived from an unexpected direction. At 10:14 p.m., one of the county geologists participating remotely requested access to the full survey archive rather than the summary reports that had been distributed throughout the day. The request seemed routine at first. 20 minutes later, it no longer seemed routine. The geologist called back immediately and asked to speak directly with Ethan. The conversation was brief, but when it ended, every trace of hesitation had disappeared from the engineer's face. Months of archived measurements revealed a trend nobody had noticed because each individual change had been too small to attract attention. The mountain had not begun moving 3 weeks ago. It had likely begun moving months ago. The signs Henry noticed among the bees, the stream, and the strange sounds had not marked the beginning of the problem. They had marked the point where the problem became visible. A silence settled over the room as the implications became clear. If the mountain had been slowly destabilizing for months, then every new measurement might represent the later stages of a much larger process. No one knew exactly how much time remained. No one knew whether that time would be measured in days, hours, or something even shorter. For the first time all day, the uncertainty itself became the reason to act rather than the reason to wait. Mayor Grayson looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the engineers, emergency coordinators, law enforcement officers, and public safety officials gathered around him. Then he looked toward Henry Whitaker. The old veteran said nothing. He simply met the mayor's gaze and waited. A few moments later, the mayor nodded. "Start with the priority list." No one asked what he meant. They already knew. The nursing home, assisted living residents, households requiring transportation assistance, families in the highest risk areas. The evacuation would begin quietly and systematically before expanding outward if conditions continued to deteriorate. Phones were picked up. Radios came alive. Instructions began moving through the network that Henry had spent 12 years preparing to support. As officials rushed into action, Ethan glanced toward the window where the dark silhouette of the mountain still loomed above Eagle Creek. Earlier that day, it had looked peaceful. Now it looked patient, and for the first time since the meeting began, the town was no longer waiting to discover whether the mountain would make a decision. It had finally begun making decisions of its own. The first evacuation calls began at 10:32 p.m. Most of Eagle Creek never noticed them. That was intentional. The mayor, emergency coordinators, and law enforcement officers understood that the first phase depended entirely on remaining calm. If word spread too quickly, traffic would form before transportation resources were fully deployed. If panic started, every carefully prepared plan could unravel within minutes. The initial notifications therefore focused only on the people Henry Whitaker had identified years earlier: nursing home residents, individuals dependent on medical equipment, elderly couples living alone, households without reliable transportation. Names from a list that many people in the room had viewed with skepticism only hours before were now becoming the foundation of the town's response. Within 30 minutes, vehicles began moving quietly through the community. Ambulances arrived at the nursing home. Volunteer drivers reported to designated staging areas. Sheriff's deputies started contacting residents who required special assistance. Martha Reynolds coordinated transfers with the calm efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the process countless times. Watching the operation unfold, Ethan Mercer experienced an uncomfortable realization. Henry's list was not simply accurate, it was remarkably detailed. Every address matched. Every medical note proved useful. Every transportation concern had already been anticipated. 12 years of preparation were now saving hours they no longer possessed. The old veteran moved through the council chamber almost unnoticed while officials carried out the plan. He offered suggestions when asked, answered questions when necessary, and otherwise remained silent. There was no sense of satisfaction in his expression, no indication that being proven right brought him any comfort. If anything, he looked more troubled than before. Outside, the festival continued. Live music echoed across Main Street. Visitors filled restaurants. Teenagers gathered near food trucks. Children carried glowing toys beneath strings of decorative lights. The town still looked like a place celebrating the start of a memorable weekend. That illusion began to crack shortly after 11 o'clock, when several hotel managers received requests from county officials asking them to prepare guest lists and occupancy reports. Questions spread quickly. Rumors followed. Some visitors assumed a severe weather warning had been issued. Others speculated about a chemical spill or a forest fire. The truth remained known only to a small group of people inside the council chamber. Yet the atmosphere throughout town was beginning to change. People sensed movement around them. They noticed emergency vehicles traveling unfamiliar routes. They saw deputies knocking on doors. They saw buses arriving where no buses should have been arriving at that hour. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to recognize when something is different even before they understand why. By midnight, the first phase of the evacuation was underway. Nursing home residents were being transported to facilities outside the valley. Several medically fragile individuals had already been relocated. Transportation teams moved steadily from one address to another, while dispatchers tracked progress on maps spread across the operations tables. For a brief period, the system worked exactly as designed. Then the mountain reminded everyone that it would not operate according to their timetable. A new survey update arrived shortly after 12:17 a.m. The report contained no dramatic language, Engineers rarely used dramatic language. They preferred numbers, measurements, distances, rates of movement. Yet the data produced the same reaction throughout the room. The acceleration had increased again, not slightly, significantly. Ethan reviewed the figures twice before handing them to the county geologist participating remotely. The response came back within minutes. If the measurements were accurate, the slope was becoming progressively less stable. Nobody could estimate precisely when failure might occur. What they could say was that the trend was moving in the wrong direction. The update forced the mayor to make another decision. Waiting until morning was no longer realistic. At 12:41 a.m., the second phase of the evacuation began. Public notification systems activated across Eagle Creek. Emergency messages appeared on mobile phones. Local radio stations interrupted programming. Hotel managers received instructions. Sheriff's deputies expanded door-to-door notifications into additional neighborhoods. Within minutes, the quiet operation transformed into something much larger. Confusion spread first, then concern, then movement. Vehicles began filling roads. Families loaded belongings into trunks. Business owners locked doors. Visitors asked questions that few officials had time to answer fully. The town was not panicking, but it was no longer calm. It had entered the uncertain space between warning and disaster, where every person must decide how seriously to take information that cannot yet be fully explained. Throughout the night, Henry remained near the operations center. Several times, Ethan noticed him studying incoming reports, with the same expression he used when looking at the mountain. He wasn't searching for confirmation, he was searching for patterns. Shortly before 1 o'clock, the engineer finally asked what he was thinking. Henry remained silent for several seconds before answering. He explained that the situation felt wrong. Not because the mountain was moving, they already knew that. What troubled him was the pace. The changes were occurring faster than he expected. Ethan asked whether that meant the collapse could happen sooner than predicted. Henry admitted he didn't know. That uncertainty frightened him more than any answer could have. 52 years earlier, he had convinced himself there was still time. He had spent half a century regretting that assumption. He had no intention of making the same mistake again. Outside the council building, the evacuation expanded steadily. Long lines of vehicles formed along several routes leading out of town. Volunteers distributed information sheets at temporary checkpoints. Emergency shelters reported their first arrivals, yet not everyone agreed to leave. Some residents refused outright. Others insisted the warning was exaggerated. A few argued that the mountain had stood above Eagle Creek for generations and would continue standing long after the current crisis passed. The resistance frustrated officials but surprised nobody. Every disaster produced the same reaction. Some people feared acting too soon more than acting too late. As reports continued arriving throughout the night, the challenge became increasingly clear. The greatest obstacle was no longer convincing people that the mountain might be dangerous. The greatest obstacle was convincing them that danger could arrive before it became visible. At 1:26 a.m., another message arrived from the Western Survey team. This time the room grew silent before Ethan even finished reading it. Fresh cracking had appeared near an area that showed no visible instability only hours earlier. Additional drone imagery confirmed widening movement across multiple sections of the slope. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The mountain was no longer behaving like a single unstable section. It was behaving like an interconnected system under stress. Engineers immediately began reviewing worst-case scenarios, while emergency managers accelerated relocation efforts. Around the room, phones rang continuously. Radios crackled without pause. Maps filled with handwritten notes. The operation that had once seemed precautionary now felt urgent. As the clock moved toward 2 in the morning, Ethan stepped outside for a moment and looked across Eagle Creek. The festival lights still glowed in parts of town, though many had begun shutting down. Streams of headlights stretched along evacuation routes leading away from the valley. Sirens echoed occasionally in the distance. Above everything else stood the mountain, dark and silent against the night sky. From where he stood, it looked unchanged. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. Catastrophe rarely announced itself with dramatic visuals. Often it arrived hidden behind appearances that seemed perfectly ordinary. Ethan thought about Henry's brother, about the 19 men in the photograph, about a younger version of Henry standing beneath another mountain, believing there was still time. Then he looked back toward the operations center where hundreds of decisions were now being made because one old veteran had refused to ignore what everyone else had overlooked. For the first time since the crisis began, Ethan allowed himself to hope they had started moving people early enough. Unfortunately, the next report waiting inside would challenge that hope more than any report that had come before. The report arrived at 2:07 a.m., and within moments, every conversation inside the operations center stopped. Ethan Mercer read the message once, then again, hoping fatigue had caused him to misinterpret what he was seeing. It hadn't. Aerial thermal imaging combined with the latest ground measurements indicated that a much larger section of the mountain was moving than anyone had previously estimated. The instability was no longer confined to the fracture line, nor to the growing bulge that had dominated discussions throughout the day. The entire western face appeared to be under stress. Nobody in the room needed an explanation of what that meant. The models immediately became more complicated. The potential debris field became larger. The margin for error became smaller. Around the operations tables, engineers exchanged worried glances, while emergency managers quietly accelerated timelines that already felt impossibly compressed. Mayor Grayson listened to the briefing without interrupting. When it ended, he asked only one question: how much time did they think remained? The answer nobody wanted arrived in the form of silence. Eventually, the county geologist admitted what every expert in the room was thinking. They didn't know. That uncertainty transformed the evacuation from an organized precaution into a race. Across Eagle Creek, deputies expanded notifications to neighborhoods that had not originally been included in the highest risk zones. Additional buses were redirected toward the valley. Shelter coordinators reported increasing arrivals throughout the region. Hotel parking lots emptied as visitors packed vehicles and joined streams of traffic moving toward the main highways. The roads remained passable, but congestion was steadily worsening. Every new vehicle added friction to a system operating under growing pressure. Inside the operations center, giant maps covering the walls slowly filled with handwritten updates. Roads marked in green earlier that evening were gradually changing to yellow. Several routes were now being monitored continuously. Henry Whitaker watched the process unfold from a corner of the room. He said little, but his attention never drifted. More than once, Ethan noticed the old veteran staring not at the maps, but at the clock. 52 years earlier, time had slipped away while People D, Chapter 9. The report arrived at 2:07 a.m., and within moments, every conversation inside the operations center stopped. Ethan Mercer read the message once, then again, hoping fatigue had caused him to misinterpret what he was seeing. It hadn't. Aerial thermal imaging combined with the latest ground measurements indicated that a much larger section of the mountain was moving than anyone had previously estimated. The instability was no longer confined to the fracture line, nor to the growing bulge that had dominated discussions throughout the day. The entire western face appeared to be under stress. Nobody in the room needed an explanation of what that meant. The models immediately became more complicated. The potential debris field became larger. The margin for error became smaller. Around the operations tables, engineers exchanged worried glances, while emergency managers quietly accelerated timelines that already felt impossibly compressed. Mayor Grayson listened to the briefing without interrupting. When it ended, he asked only one question: how much time did they think remained? The answer nobody wanted arrived in the form of silence. Eventually, the county geologist admitted what every expert in the room was thinking: they didn't know. That uncertainty transformed the evacuation from an organized precaution into a race. Across Eagle Creek, deputies expanded notifications to neighborhoods that had not originally been included in the highest risk zones. Additional buses were redirected toward the valley. Shelter coordinators reported increasing arrivals throughout the region. Hotel parking lots emptied as visitors packed vehicles and joined streams of traffic moving toward the main highways. The roads remained passable, but congestion was steadily worsening. Every new vehicle added friction to a system operating under growing pressure. Inside the operations center, giant maps covering the walls slowly filled with handwritten updates. Roads marked in green earlier that evening were gradually changing to yellow. Several routes were now being monitored continuously. Henry Whitaker watched the process unfold from a corner of the room. He said little, but his attention never drifted. More than once, Ethan noticed the old veteran staring not at the maps, but at the clock. 52 years earlier, time had slipped away while people debated what they should do. Tonight, the town was moving, yet Henry still seemed uneasy. The realization troubled Ethan. If a man who had spent the entire day urging action remained worried after the evacuation had begun, perhaps the danger was even greater than anyone understood. Around 2:40 a.m., a transportation coordinator approached the mayor with another problem. Several residents living along the eastern edge of town were refusing to leave. Some believed the warning was exaggerated. Others insisted they would wait until daylight. A few simply didn't trust information that arrived in the middle of the night. The reaction frustrated officials but surprised no one. Human beings often struggle to respond to threats they cannot personally see. The mountain remained distant. The night remained calm. No rocks were falling. No ground was shaking. To many residents, the danger still felt theoretical. The mayor considered dispatching additional deputies before Henry quietly spoke from across the room. He suggested sending people they knew instead: volunteers, neighbors, church leaders, local business owners, anyone trusted by the community. The advice initially sounded almost too simple, but within an hour it proved effective. Residents who ignored official warnings often listened when someone familiar stood on their porch and explained the situation face to face. The solution worked because it addressed something every evacuation depends upon. Information matters. Trust matters more. By 3 o'clock, exhaustion had begun settling over everyone involved. Coffee cups accumulated across tables. Conversations grew shorter. Tempers occasionally surfaced and then disappeared just as quickly. Yet, despite the fatigue, progress continued. Thousands of people had already left the valley. The nursing home had been fully relocated. Medical transfers were complete. Emergency shelters reported available capacity. For the first time all night, officials allowed themselves a small measure of optimism. The operation was far from finished, but it was working. Ethan found himself wondering whether the mountain might ultimately stabilize without collapsing at all. Perhaps the town would endure a difficult night, lose a weekend festival, and wake to discover the threat had passed. The thought remained alive for less than 20 minutes. At 3:22 a.m., a seismic sensor positioned along the western ridge registered a sudden spike. The reading lasted only seconds, but it immediately triggered automated alerts across the monitoring network. Engineers rushed toward the displays while technicians began pulling supporting data from nearby instruments. The room that had briefly relaxed snapped back into focus. Additional readings followed, then another. None of them individually indicated collapse. Together, however, they pointed toward accelerating internal movement beneath the slope. The county geologist joined the analysis remotely and spent several tense minutes reviewing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a level of concern that nobody had heard earlier in the night. He explained that the mountain appeared to be entering a new phase of instability. The statement was carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. Conditions were worsening faster than expected. Mayor Grayson immediately ordered expansion of the evacuation zone. Additional emergency alerts were issued. More neighborhoods received notifications. The operation entered its most aggressive stage yet. Outside, the character of the night had begun changing. Traffic streamed continuously along the roads leading away from Eagle Creek. Emergency vehicles moved through town with increasing frequency. Volunteers knocked on doors. Deputies guided vehicles through crowded intersections. Even residents who had initially doubted the warnings were beginning to understand that something serious was happening. Rumors had given way to visible action. People no longer asked whether officials were concerned. They could see the concern in every flashing light and every hurried conversation. Yet the mountain itself remained hidden in darkness, offering no obvious sign of the forces building inside it. That silence reminded Ethan of something Henry had said earlier in the evening. Human beings often mistake the absence of visible danger for actual safety. Looking towards the ridgeline, he finally understood why that mistake could be so deadly. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Henry stepped outside the operations center for the first time in hours. Ethan followed him. The air had grown colder, and the streets around the council building looked dramatically different from the bustling festival town that had existed only a day earlier. Many storefronts were dark. Traffic flowed steadily toward the highways. Volunteers worked beneath portable floodlights. Above it all, the mountain loomed against the fading stars. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then Ethan asked the question that had been troubling him for hours. If Henry could go back 52 years, knowing everything he knew now, what would he change? The old veteran continued staring toward the darkness before answering. He said he would have trusted the things that didn't fit. The strange sounds, the unusual water, the experienced workers who felt something was wrong. Every piece of information that seemed inconvenient at the time eventually proved important. Ethan thought about that answer as they stood beneath the night sky. Modern technology had provided more data than Henry could ever have imagined in his youth. Yet in the end, the crisis had begun, because one old man paid attention to details everyone else overlooked. When they returned inside, a new message was waiting. This one came not from a sensor or a survey team, but from a helicopter crew conducting thermal observations along the western face. The pilot reported visible movement, not projected movement, not calculated movement, visible movement. Sections of the slope were beginning to shift. The report triggered immediate activity throughout the room. Engineers rushed to confirm the observation, while emergency managers accelerated final evacuation efforts. No one needed to debate probabilities anymore. The mountain had crossed an invisible threshold. Whether collapse occurred in hours or minutes no longer mattered. What mattered was how many people could still be moved before nature made the next decision. As alarms, radios, and phones filled the operations center with noise, Henry Whitaker looked toward the mountain one final time. 52 years earlier, he had watched a warning become a tragedy. Tonight, for the first time in more than half a century, he dared to believe that history might not end the same way. Unfortunately, the next hour would test that belief more severely than anything that had come before. Bated what they should do. Tonight, the town was moving, yet Henry still seemed uneasy. The realization troubled Ethan. If a man who had spent the entire day urging action remained worried after the evacuation had begun, perhaps the danger was even greater than anyone understood. Around 2:40 a.m., a transportation coordinator approached the mayor with another problem. Several residents living along the eastern edge of town were refusing to leave. Some believed the warning was exaggerated. Others insisted they would wait until daylight. A few simply didn't trust information that arrived in the middle of the night. The reaction frustrated officials but surprised no one. Human beings often struggle to respond to threats they cannot personally see. The mountain remained distant. The night remained calm. No rocks were falling, no ground was shaking. To many residents, the danger still felt theoretical. The mayor considered dispatching additional deputies before Henry quietly spoke from across the room. He suggested sending people they knew instead. Volunteers, neighbors, church leaders, local business owners, anyone trusted by the community. The advice initially sounded almost too simple, but within an hour it proved effective. Residents who ignored official warnings often listened when someone familiar stood on their porch and explained the situation face to face. The solution worked because it addressed something every evacuation depends upon. Information matters. Trust matters more. By 3 o'clock, exhaustion had begun settling over everyone involved. Coffee cups accumulated across tables. Conversations grew shorter. Tempers occasionally surfaced and then disappeared just as quickly. Yet despite the fatigue, progress continued. Thousands of people had already left the valley. The nursing home had been fully relocated. Medical transfers were complete. Emergency shelters reported available capacity. For the first time all night, officials allowed themselves a small measure of optimism. The operation was far from finished, but it was working. Ethan found himself wondering whether the mountain might ultimately stabilize without collapsing at all. Perhaps the town would endure a difficult night, lose a weekend festival, and wake to discover the threat had passed. The thought remained alive for less than 20 minutes. At 3:22 a.m., a seismic sensor positioned along the western ridge registered a sudden spike. The reading lasted only seconds, but it immediately triggered automated alerts across the monitoring network. Engineers rushed toward the displays, while technicians began pulling supporting data from nearby instruments. The room that had briefly relaxed snapped back into focus. Additional readings followed, then another. None of them individually indicated collapse. Together, however, they pointed toward accelerating internal movement beneath the slope. The county geologist joined the analysis remotely and spent several tense minutes reviewing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a level of concern that nobody had heard earlier in the night. He explained that the mountain appeared to be entering a new phase of instability. The statement was carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. Conditions were worsening faster than expected. Mayor Grayson immediately ordered expansion of the evacuation zone. Additional emergency alerts were issued. More neighborhoods received notifications. The operation entered its most aggressive stage yet. Outside, the character of the night had begun changing. Traffic streamed continuously along the roads leading away from Eagle Creek. Emergency vehicles moved through town with increasing frequency. Volunteers knocked on doors. Deputies guided vehicles through crowded intersections. Even residents who had initially doubted the warnings were beginning to understand that something serious was happening. Rumors had given way to visible action. People no longer asked whether officials were concerned. They could see the concern in every flashing light and every hurried conversation. Yet the mountain itself remained hidden in darkness, offering no obvious sign of the forces building inside it. That silence reminded Ethan of something Henry had said earlier in the evening. Human beings often mistake the absence of visible danger for actual safety. Looking toward the ridgeline, he finally understood why that mistake could be so deadly. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Henry stepped outside the operations center for the first time in hours. Ethan followed him. The air had grown colder, and the streets around the council building looked dramatically different from the bustling festival town that had existed only a day earlier. Many storefronts were dark. Traffic flowed steadily toward the highways. Volunteers worked beneath portable floodlights. Above it all, the mountain loomed against the fading stars. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then Ethan asked the question that had been troubling him for hours. If Henry could go back 52 years, knowing everything he knew now, what would he change? The old veteran continued staring toward the darkness before answering. He said he would have trusted the things that didn't fit, the strange sounds, the unusual water, the experienced workers who felt something was wrong. Every piece of information that seemed inconvenient at the time eventually proved important. Ethan thought about that answer as they stood beneath the night sky. Modern technology had provided more data than Henry could ever have imagined in his youth. Yet in the end, the crisis had begun because one old man paid attention to details everyone else overlooked. When they returned inside, a new message was waiting. This one came not from a sensor or a survey team, but from a helicopter crew conducting thermal observations along the western face. The pilot reported visible movement, not projected movement, not calculated movement, visible movement. Sections of the slope were beginning to shift. The report triggered immediate activity throughout the room. Engineers rushed to confirm the observation, while emergency managers accelerated final evacuation efforts. No one needed to debate probabilities anymore. The mountain had crossed an invisible threshold. Whether collapse occurred in hours or minutes no longer mattered. What mattered was how many people could still be moved before nature made the next decision. As alarms, radios, and phones filled the operations center with noise, Henry Whitaker looked toward the mountain one final time. 52 years earlier, he had watched a warning become a tragedy. Tonight, for the first time in more than half a century, he dared to believe that history might not end the same way. Unfortunately, the next hour would test that belief more severely than anything that had come before. By 4:11 a.m., the operations center no longer resembled the orderly planning room it had been earlier in the evening. Every available table was covered with maps, traffic reports, evacuation updates, and incoming survey data. Radios crackled continuously. Phones rang almost without pause. Volunteers moved between departments carrying information that seemed to become outdated almost as quickly as it arrived. Yet beneath the urgency, a strange sense of focus had settled over the room. The debates were gone. The uncertainty that had dominated most of the previous day had largely disappeared. Nobody was asking whether the mountain posed a threat anymore. The only question that remained was whether they could move enough people before the threat arrived. The helicopter crew's report of visible movement had changed everything. Engineers quickly confirmed the observation using multiple data sources. Sections of the western face were shifting in ways that could now be detected without specialized instruments. The movement remained subtle from a distance, but it was real. More importantly, it was accelerating. Ethan Mercer stood with a group of geologists reviewing updated projections while emergency managers expanded evacuation boundaries yet again. Every new calculation produced slightly different numbers, but all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. The margin of safety was shrinking. Across the room, Mayor Grayson coordinated with state officials, while Sheriff Collins directed traffic resources toward the most congested routes. The town had already relocated thousands of people, yet thousands more remained. Some were still packing belongings, some were assisting neighbors, Some were only now beginning to accept that the warnings might be justified. Time, which had seemed abundant 24 hours earlier, had become the most valuable resource in Eagle Creek. Outside, the character of the evacuation continued changing. Earlier in the night, many residents had treated the process as a precaution. They loaded vehicles calmly and expected to return home within a day or two. Now the mood was different. Word had spread that helicopters were observing movement on the mountain. Rumors traveled faster than official statements ever could. Residents standing in gas station parking lots exchanged stories. Hotel guests shared updates from social media. Volunteers repeated fragments of conversations overheard from deputies and emergency workers. Most of the information was incomplete. Some of it was wrong. Yet all of it contributed to a growing realization that the danger might be far more serious than anyone initially believed. Long lines of vehicles stretched toward the highways leading out of the valley. Temporary shelters reported steady arrivals. Traffic remained moving, but only barely. Every delay now carried consequences. Around 4:38 a.m., and another update arrived from the helicopter crew. This time the pilot included video. The footage was grainy and difficult to interpret at first, but as engineers enlarged the image, the room grew quiet. The movement was no longer theoretical. Small sections of rock and soil could be seen shifting downslope. Individually, the slides were minor. Collectively, they revealed a system approaching failure. Ethan watched the footage several times before looking toward Henry Whitaker. The old veteran was studying the screen with an expression Ethan had come to recognize. It was the look of a man seeing something he had hoped never to see again. 52 years had passed since the disaster that claimed his brother and 18 other workers, yet the memories remained close enough that a single image could pull them back into the present. Ethan realized that Henry was no longer comparing the current situation to the past. In his mind, the two events had already become the same story. As dawn approached, faint gray light began appearing along the eastern horizon. The change brought little comfort. Visibility improved, allowing survey teams to gather more information, but it also revealed how much work remained. Hundreds of vehicles were still moving through evacuation routes. Entire neighborhoods had yet to clear. Emergency coordinators estimated that several more hours would be required to complete the operation. Under normal circumstances, that timeline would have been acceptable. Nobody was certain they still possessed several more hours. The county geologist, who had remained connected remotely throughout the night, finally stopped speaking in probabilities. He explained that while predicting the exact moment of collapse remained impossible, all available indicators suggested the mountain was approaching a critical state. The statement was carefully worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Officials were no longer preparing for something that might happen. They were preparing for something they believed would happen. The first direct sign arrived at 5:12 a.m. Residents positioned near the outer edge of the evacuation zone began reporting sounds. The descriptions varied from person to person. Some compared them to distant thunder. Others described deep cracking noises echoing across the valley. A few said it sounded like heavy machinery operating somewhere beyond the ridge. Henry heard the reports and immediately closed his eyes. The room noticed. Nobody needed to ask why. Every person present remembered the story he had shared the previous evening. The sounds had come first then, too. The mountain announcing itself in a language most people did not understand until it was too late. Sheriff Collins quickly ordered remaining field teams to withdraw from areas closest to the slope. Additional warnings were issued. Roadblocks were expanded. The operation accelerated yet again. For the next 40 minutes, Eagle Creek existed in a state of suspended tension. Vehicles continued leaving town. Emergency crews continued working. The mountain continued moving, yet the collapse itself never came. Human beings have a remarkable ability to adapt even to extraordinary circumstances, and some officials began wondering whether the danger might stabilize long enough to finish the evacuation. Hope returned cautiously, almost unwillingly. Ethan felt it himself. They had moved thousands of people. They had acted faster than many communities would have. Perhaps they had bought enough time. Perhaps Henry's greatest fear would remain only a fear. Then, at 5:58 a.m., a survey drone transmitted a live image that erased those thoughts instantly. The footage showed a widening crack stretching across a section of the western face. Engineers watched in silence as pieces of rock broke free and tumbled downward. The movement lasted only seconds before the transmission ended, yet it was enough. The mountain was no longer merely shifting. It was beginning to fail. Every alarm inside the operations center seemed to activate at once. Emergency notifications expanded to the final remaining sectors. Transportation resources were redirected. Deputies ordered immediate withdrawal from vulnerable areas. Conversations disappeared beneath the flood of activity. Decisions that might once have taken hours were now being made in seconds. Through it all, Henry remained standing near the operations table, watching the screen. The old veteran had spent more than half a century carrying guilt for a tragedy he believed he should have prevented. For decades, he replayed every warning sign he ignored, every hesitation, every decision that seemed reasonable until consequences arrived. Yet as he looked around the operations center that morning, he saw something fundamentally different from what he remembered. 52 years earlier, people waited, they questioned, they delayed, they assumed there would be more time. This time an entire town had acted. Engineers listened, officials listened, volunteers listened. Thousands of residents had already been moved because someone chose to pay attention before certainty arrived. Whatever happened next, Eagle Creek had not repeated the mistake that haunted him for most of his life. At 6:07 a.m., the first major section of the mountainside finally gave way. The sound reached the valley seconds before anyone saw the movement. A deep, rolling roar echoed across the landscape, powerful enough to silence conversations throughout the operations center. Every head turned toward the windows. Beyond the town, above the forests and ridgelines, a massive cloud of dust began rising into the morning sky. For a moment, nobody moved. Not because they were frozen by fear, but because they understood they were witnessing the event they had spent the last 24 hours racing to outrun. Then the radios erupted with reports from observation teams positioned at safe distances. The collapse was underway. The mountain had finally made its decision, and now Eagle Creek would discover whether its own decisions had been made in time. The sound arrived first. Even after everything that had happened over the previous 24 hours, the roar that rolled across the valley exceeded anything most people in Eagle Creek had imagined. It was not a single explosion or a sudden crash. It was a deep, continuous sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the mountain itself had begun tearing apart from the inside. Inside the operations center, conversations stopped instantly. Radios fell silent for a brief moment before erupting with overlapping transmissions. Outside, people along evacuation routes slowed their vehicles and looked toward the western ridge. The rising sun had only begun to clear the horizon, casting pale light across the valley, and against that early morning sky, a massive cloud of dust was already climbing upward. For several seconds, nobody inside the operations center moved. Then training and responsibility took over. Engineers rushed toward incoming data feeds. Emergency coordinators began requesting status reports. Deputies checked road conditions. The collapse they had spent an entire day preparing for was no longer a possibility. It was happening. The first reports arrived from observation teams positioned miles away from the slope. Large sections of the western face were moving downslope. Trees disappeared beneath waves of soil and shattered rock. Entire portions of the mountainside seemed to liquefy as gravity pulled them downward. Yet even as the reports grew more alarming, one detail immediately stood out. The collapse was occurring almost exactly where the models predicted it would. Ethan Mercer seized on that fact. If the projections remained accurate, the debris field should remain largely confined to the highest risk zone, the very area officials had prioritized during the evacuation. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was the first encouraging piece of information anyone had received in hours. Around him, teams continued working furiously. New maps appeared on monitors. Drone operators launched aircraft. State emergency officials joined conference calls. Every incoming report carried enormous significance because somewhere beyond the dust cloud were roads, buildings, and neighborhoods that only hours earlier had still contained residents. For Henry Whitaker, however, the noise around him seemed strangely distant. He stood near the window and watched the dust rising above the ridge while memories he had spent decades trying to control surged back with unsettling clarity. The sounds were almost identical. The feeling in his chest was almost identical. Even the morning light reminded him of another dawn 52 years earlier. The difference was that this time he was not 29 years old. This time he was not standing beneath the mountain. This time people had listened. That thought became an anchor as reports continued arriving. He remembered the helplessness he had felt during the earlier disaster, watching events unfold after every opportunity to act had already passed. What he felt now was different. Fear remained. Uncertainty remained. But there was also the fragile possibility that tragedy and loss would not define the ending. Nearby, Ethan was coordinating with survey teams when he noticed Henry staring toward the ridge. The engineer understood without asking what the old man was remembering. For the first time since they had met, Ethan found himself hoping not only for the safety of the town, but also for something more personal. He hoped Henry would finally receive an answer to a question he had been carrying for most of his life. As the collapse continued, the scale of the event became increasingly apparent. Drone footage revealed an enormous scar carved across the western face of the mountain. Entire sections of forest had vanished beneath millions of tons of debris. Access roads were gone. Utility lines had been destroyed. Several structures located inside the restricted zone had been completely buried. Yet the most important information still remained unknown. Had anyone been left behind? The question hovered over every conversation. Officials began cross-checking evacuation records against shelter registrations. Deputies contacted transportation teams. Volunteers verified lists. The process was painstaking because accuracy mattered more than speed. Nobody wanted assumptions. They wanted confirmation. Hours earlier, the town had operated under uncertainty about the mountain. Now the uncertainty centered on people. By late morning, the dust cloud had begun settling enough for helicopters to conduct more detailed assessments. The images returning from the affected area were sobering. The landscape had been transformed. Familiar landmarks no longer existed. Sections of road had disappeared beneath debris fields, hundreds of feet wide. Streams had been redirected. Entire hillsides had changed shape. Looking at the photographs, it became difficult to imagine that the same mountain had stood quietly above Eagle Creek only a day earlier. Yet amid the destruction came another encouraging development. No evidence suggested that large numbers of residents had been caught inside the collapse zone. Search teams continued verifying information, but the early signs were promising. The evacuation had reached farther and moved faster than many officials originally believed possible. Around the operations center, cautious optimism began appearing for the first time since the crisis started. Nobody celebrated. It was far too early for that, but shoulders relaxed slightly. Conversations became less frantic. Hope, which had spent most of the previous day hiding behind caution, slowly began re-emerge. The breakthrough came shortly after noon. Emergency managers completed the first comprehensive accountability review. The process took nearly an hour as teams compared shelter records, transportation manifests, nursing home transfers, hotel occupancy reports, and law enforcement data. When the final numbers were presented, the room fell silent. Then everyone checked the figures again because they seemed almost impossible to believe. Despite the scale of the collapse, despite the complexity of the evacuation, despite the fact that thousands of people had been moved within a matter of hours, only a handful of individuals remained unaccounted for. Most were quickly located through follow-up calls and registration checks. One by one, names disappeared from the missing person list. The tension that had gripped the room all morning gradually loosened. Ethan looked toward the mayor, who stared at the report for several seconds before lowering it. Neither man said anything immediately because both understood what the numbers represented. An entire community had come frighteningly close to disaster and somehow managed to stay ahead of it. Henry remained near the window even after the accountability review ended. Outside, sunlight now illuminated the distant dust cloud hanging over the damaged mountainside. The operation was far from over. Recovery efforts would continue for months, perhaps years. Roads would need rebuilding, infrastructure would need repair, families would eventually return to changed neighborhoods. Yet for the first time since noticing the abandoned beehives weeks earlier, Henry felt something inside him begin to loosen. The feeling was unfamiliar enough that it took him a moment to recognize it. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was something closer to peace. 52 years earlier, he had watched a mountain take people because warnings arrived too late and action arrived later still. This time, an entire town had chosen differently. Engineers listened, officials listened, neighbors listened. The chain of decisions that followed had saved lives. No amount of success could erase the past, but perhaps the purpose of surviving regret was not to erase it. Perhaps the purpose was to learn enough from it that someone else would never have to carry the same burden. The thought remained with him as another report arrived near the end of the afternoon. Search teams had completed their final verification. The remaining missing names had all been accounted for. Some residents were staying with relatives. Others had checked into shelters without immediately registering. A few had simply ignored instructions and left town on their own. The important fact was now undeniable. The evacuation had worked. The room absorbed the news quietly, almost reverently. No cheers erupted, no applause followed. Everyone understood how close the outcome could have been to something very different. Across the operations center, exhausted officials exchanged tired smiles and returned to their work. The emergency was not over, but the worst possibility had been avoided. As Henry looked once more toward the scarred mountainside beyond Eagle Creek, he realized that for the first time in more than half a century, the memory of one mountain was no longer the only thing he saw when he looked at another. The story was not finished yet, but the ending was finally beginning to change. The day after the collapse dawned with a strange kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows an event so large that people are still trying to understand it. Throughout Eagle Creek, evacuation shelters remained active. Emergency crews continued working, and residents followed updates with an intensity usually reserved for major national events. The mountain that had dominated the horizon for generations now carried a massive scar across its western face, visible from nearly every point in town. News helicopters circled overhead. State officials arrived. Geologists examined the debris field. Reporters interviewed emergency personnel and displaced families. Everywhere people looked, there was evidence that something historic had occurred. Yet beneath the activity ran another realization, one that became clearer with every passing hour. The disaster everyone feared had happened. The catastrophe everyone feared had not. That distinction mattered. By mid-morning, detailed assessments confirmed what many officials had barely dared to hope for the previous day. Homes had been lost. Roads had been destroyed. Infrastructure damage would require months of repair. Yet the evacuation had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections. Thousands of people had been moved from vulnerable areas before the mountainside failed. Schools serving as temporary shelters remained crowded, but orderly. Medical transfers had been completed safely. Families were beginning to reunite. The stories emerging from the shelters all shared a common theme. People kept describing how close everything felt. A nursing home resident spoke about seeing emergency vehicles arrive only hours before the collapse. A hotel manager recalled helping guests leave in the middle of the night. Parents described loading sleeping children into cars without fully understanding why officials seemed so urgent. Every account reinforced the same truth. Timing had made the difference. Inside the operations center, however, celebration remained absent. Most of the people who had worked through the crisis were too exhausted to think about celebration. Ethan Mercer had slept less than 2 hours in nearly 48. Sheriff Collins looked as though he had aged several years since the council meeting began. Mayor Grayson spent most of the morning coordinating recovery efforts and speaking with state authorities. Yet, despite the fatigue, a subtle shift had taken place. The tension that had gripped everyone for days was gone. Decisions no longer carried life or death consequences every few minutes. The mountain had already done what it was going to do. Now came the long process of understanding what remained. Around noon, Ethan finally stepped away from the operations center and drove toward one of the observation areas overlooking the damaged slope. He wasn't entirely sure why he was going. Part of him wanted to see the destruction with his own eyes. Another part wanted to find Henry. He found the old veteran exactly where he expected. Henry stood alone behind a temporary safety barrier overlooking the valley. The collapse zone stretched across the mountainside like a wound. Entire sections of forest had vanished. Roads ended abruptly where the debris field swallowed them. Streams flowed through entirely new channels. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Standing there, Ethan understood why experienced geologists often described landslides as moving landscapes rather than moving objects. The mountain itself seemed altered. Henry remained silent as Ethan approached. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They simply looked at the scar carved into the slope. Eventually, Ethan asked whether it looked similar to the one from 52 years earlier. The old veteran considered the question carefully before answering. In some ways, it did. In others, it didn't. The physical destruction felt familiar. The emotions did not. That answer lingered between them. For decades, Henry had imagined what he would say if he ever faced a similar situation again. He had replayed conversations that never happened, rehearsed warnings no one heard, rewritten decisions that could never be changed. Yet now that another mountain had finally collapsed, he discovered that reality was different from memory. The guilt he carried had always convinced him that one correct decision could have saved everyone long ago. Age had gradually taught him something more complicated. Human beings rarely possess perfect information. They make decisions with whatever knowledge exists at the time. Sometimes those decisions lead to outcomes nobody wants. The lesson was not that mistakes never happen, The lesson was that people must be willing to act when uncertainty still exists. Looking across the damaged landscape, Henry realized that Eagle Creek had done exactly that. Officials acted before certainty arrived. Engineers listened before evidence became overwhelming. Residents moved before the danger became visible. The town succeeded not because anyone predicted the future perfectly, but because they respected the possibility that they might be wrong. Later that afternoon, a small gathering formed near the operations center. No official ceremony had been planned. Nobody had organized speeches. Yet word spread naturally through volunteers, emergency personnel, and local residents that many of the people responsible for the evacuation would be present. Families stopped by to thank deputies. Shelter workers received handshakes and hugs. Medical teams were recognized for their efforts. The mood felt less like a celebration and more like collective gratitude. At one point, Mayor Grayson found himself standing beside Henry, while several residents approached to express appreciation. The old veteran looked deeply uncomfortable during every interaction. He accepted thanks politely, but never seemed interested in receiving credit. Eventually, the mayor laughed and told him he was handling compliments worse than the collapse itself. Henry smiled for the first time in days and admitted that he probably was. The moment that affected him most came near sunset. A woman in her early 70s approached carrying an old photograph. Henry recognized her immediately. She was the daughter of one of the workers who had died in the collapse 52 years earlier. He had not seen her in years. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then she handed him the photograph. It showed a group of men standing beside construction equipment near a mountainside. The image was different from the one Henry kept in his notebook, but many of the faces were the same, including his brothers. The woman explained that she had followed the news all day and wanted him to have a copy. Henry stared at the picture for a long time. When he finally looked up, she told him something he had never heard before. "My father wouldn't want you carrying that guilt anymore." The words struck harder than the collapse itself. For more than half a century, Henry had lived with the assumption that the families of those men blamed him. Perhaps some did. Perhaps some always would. Yet standing there with the photograph in his hands, he realized that the people who suffered the same loss had also spent decades living their own lives, raising families, and finding ways to move forward. They remembered the tragedy, but they were not trapped inside it. In that moment, Henry understood something that had escaped him for years. Forgiveness is often offered long before it is accepted. As evening settled over Eagle Creek, the crowds gradually dispersed, and the temporary gathering came to an end. The town still faced a long recovery. Roads needed rebuilding, homes required repair. The mountain would remain under observation for years. Yet beneath those practical realities, something else had changed. The story that began with abandoned beehives, unusual water, and a distant sound in the night was no longer about a mountain. It was about listening to experience, listening to evidence, listening to warnings before certainty arrives. As Henry placed the photograph carefully inside his notebook and looked once more toward the damaged ridgeline, he felt a weight shifting that he had carried for most of his life. Not disappearing. Not completely. Some losses never disappear, but for the first time in 52 years, it felt lighter. And for the first time in 52 years, he found himself looking toward the future instead of the past. 3 weeks after the collapse, Eagle Creek looked surprisingly normal. Visitors driving into town for the first time would have noticed the construction equipment, the temporary barriers, and the occasional detour signs, but they would have struggled to understand how close the community had come to disaster. Storefronts were open again. Restaurants were busy. Children rode bicycles through neighborhoods that only a month earlier had been part of an evacuation zone. The Summer Heritage Festival had long since been canceled, yet local businesses were already planning replacement events to help the town recover. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to rebuild routines after even the most unsettling experiences. Life, despite everything, continues moving forward. The mountain, however, ensured that nobody forgot. The massive scar running across its western face remained visible from nearly every part of town. Trees that had stood for generations were gone. Entire sections of landscape had been reshaped. Geologists continued monitoring the area while engineers worked on long-term stabilization plans. News crews visited less frequently now, having moved on to newer stories elsewhere, but the mountain remained. It stood as a permanent reminder of what had happened and of what almost happened. For many residents, the scar represented destruction narrowly avoided. For Henry Whitaker, it represented something far more personal. It marked the first time in 52 years that a mountain had given him a different ending. On a cool autumn morning, Henry followed his familiar routine. He walked the fence line surrounding his property, checked the gate near the stream, and stopped beside the beehives before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The colonies were thriving again. Weeks earlier, the sudden disappearance of the bees had been one of the first warnings that something unusual was happening. Now the familiar hum had returned, filling the air around the hives with steady activity. Henry stood quietly listening to the sound. Most people would have heard nothing more than insects beginning another day. To him, it sounded like reassurance. Nature had not betrayed him. It had spoken. The challenge had always been whether anyone was willing to listen. Later that afternoon, Ethan Mercer drove out to visit. Their friendship had developed naturally in the weeks following the evacuation. The engineer often claimed he was stopping by to discuss recovery reports, but both men understood that wasn't the only reason. They spent nearly an hour sitting on the porch overlooking the valley. The conversation wandered through topics both important and ordinary: road repairs, recovery funding, weather forecasts, the endless paperwork that follows every emergency. Eventually, Ethan asked a question he had been considering for days. If Henry had known exactly how events would unfold, would he have done anything differently? The old veteran thought about it carefully before answering. Age had taught him to be suspicious of simple answers to complicated questions. Finally, he admitted that he probably would have started speaking sooner, not because it would have changed the outcome, but because waiting had nearly convinced him to ignore his own instincts. The statement lingered with Ethan long after the conversation moved on. Engineers spend their careers searching for certainty. The mountain had taught him that certainty often arrives too late to be useful. As recovery efforts continued, stories from the evacuation spread throughout the region. Newspapers published articles about the nursing home relocation. Emergency management organizations requested copies of the planning documents used during the operation. State officials praised the cooperation between agencies. Yet the story people seemed most interested in involved neither government reports nor engineering models. They wanted to hear about the old veteran who noticed abandoned beehives, unusual water, and strange sounds before anyone else recognized the danger. Henry disliked the attention and avoided most interview requests. Eventually, he agreed to speak only once, and even then, he spent more time discussing the efforts of volunteers, nurses, deputies, engineers, and residents than he did talking about himself. When the interviewer asked how he knew something was wrong, Henry gave an answer that puzzled some people and resonated deeply with others. He said that experience rarely shouts. Most of the time, it whispers. The problem is that modern life is often too noisy to hear it. A few days later, a package arrived in the mail. The return address belonged to the daughter of one of the workers who had died alongside Henry's brother more than half a century earlier. Inside was a letter and another photograph. Henry sat alone at his kitchen table reading the handwritten pages. The letter spoke about memory, forgiveness, and the strange ways people carry loss through their lives. It thanked him for what he had done for Eagle Creek. It reminded him that the men lost in the earlier disaster were remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Most importantly, it repeated the same message she had shared during their conversation after the collapse. None of them would have wanted him spending 52 years trapped inside a single day. Henry folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the notebook that had accompanied him through so much of his life. For a long time he sat quietly, staring through the kitchen window toward the distant mountain. That evening, shortly before sunset, he drove to an overlook above the valley. The town spread below him, peaceful and alive. Construction crews were finishing work for the day. Lights gradually appeared in homes and businesses. Traffic moved steadily along roads that had once carried evacuation convoys. Beyond it all stood the mountain, scarred, changed, yet still part of the landscape. Henry remained there until the sky turned orange and then purple. He thought about his brother. He thought about the 19 men in the photographs. He thought about the years he spent replaying old decisions and imagining different outcomes. Regret had accompanied him for so long that he sometimes struggled to remember who he had been before carrying it. Yet standing there above Eagle Creek, he finally understood something that had taken half a century to learn. The purpose of remembering is not to remain trapped in the past. The purpose of remembering is to carry the lessons forward. As darkness settled over the valley, Henry opened his notebook one final time. The pages contained decades of observations, warnings, weather records, and fragments of a life spent paying attention. Near the back he found the most recent entry. The handwriting was steady despite his age. It described the abandoned beehives, the changes in the stream, the sounds in the night, and the evacuation that followed. Beneath those notes he added a final sentence before closing the notebook. This time they listened. For several moments he held the notebook in his hands and looked toward the mountain one last time. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who had forgotten the past. It was the smile of a man who had finally made peace with it. And somewhere beyond the valley, beyond the damaged ridge, beyond the memories that had followed him for 52 years, morning was already preparing to arrive again. Thank you for spending this journey in Eagle Creek. If this story reminded you of the value of experience, community, and paying attention to the quiet warnings life sometimes gives us, please share it with someone who might appreciate it. And before you go, let us know where you're watching from, and consider subscribing for more stories of resilience, courage, and second chances. Sometimes the smallest signs change everything. Sometimes the people willing to notice them change everything too.